Charles. As I typically say, I can never do anybody sufficient justice with their intro. So perhaps the best place to start is if you wouldn't mind just giving us a few minutes on who you are, what your interests are, what your practice is, and a bit of a brief intro as to what we're hoping to cover today.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you, I'm a kind of a lifelong martial artist, but also who I am today, other than being a father and running two businesses and how I show up in the world. I am kind of an Aikido teacher, having done martial arts and sports basically through my youth. And then by the time I was 22, I started Aikido, and that's just been my lifelong passion. I lived in Japan for 8 years practicing Aikido. Back in the day, that's already I left in 97, so it's been quite a few years since I was living there. But I was pretty much doing Aikido full time there. I did some Kyudo for a while. I also did Japanese tea ceremony, but my main passion was Aikido. I lived in the dojo for years, Uchideshi, with my teacher Saito Sensei and the founder of Aikido's dojo, which is in Iwama, Japan.
Yeah.
And then basically when I finished that, I kind of climbed the ladder of development in Japan. I went there as a shodan. I was still a young man. I was like 20. I was 26 when I went there. 25. Went back at 26. So I was in my kind of physical peak, and I just trained like a maniac and full time for 8 years.
Yeah.
And kind of achieved everything I went there to achieve, at least in Aikido in that one school. And at the end, I still wasn't satisfied. On one hand, I was very satisfied, and because I'd really assimilated the culture by then. I speak Japanese and was translating for my teacher, and I'd kind of, I was on the inside as I've always kind of, I guess, dreamed to be inside of the culture, inside that beautiful context. And loved my time in Japan. Really grew up, really became a man when I was in Japan, and at the same time, I was still feeling that something was missing for me.
Yeah.
And that's because, the reason I was attracted to Aikido, I when I was young, I did some, I think I did judo first for, probably 6 months or something like that.
Yeah.
And in between sports, I did taekwondo, then I did some karate, then I did some kendo. I had kung fu as well. I was doing kung fu a couple of summer vacations. I did kung fu. So I had all these little bits and pieces of martial arts that I loved, and I was also playing American football and baseball, American sports in school. And when I saw Aikido, there was something about Aikido that captured me, and that was the fact that the founder had this spiritual dimension to him.
Yeah,
he had his own kind of. He was a lifelong martial artist himself, and he was Morihei Ueshiba was his name, and he was quite well known in Japan back in the day, in his peak, in his prime. But he also had spiritual inclinations, and he was in a parallel path. He was following some pretty esoteric Japanese kind of shamanistic Shintoism, and through his practices, he had some type of spiritual awakening. And after he had a spiritual awakening, it transformed his Budo, his martial arts, and which came to be the expression of that awakening through his martial arts was what came to be Aikido.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, that's what I saw. I mean, I saw this beautiful Japanese martial art. All Japanese martial arts are aesthetically beautiful, but it was also so appealing to me as a young man. The stoicism, the discipline, this kind of Zen vibe to it. I loved it, but then there was something about him that drew me, and that's why that became my martial art. And yet, when I went and lived in Japan and really kind of achieved everything I wanted to achieve, not that I went there with a specific goal, I just wanted to live in Japan and train.
Yeah.
I felt that I was missing that internally. The techniques were beginning to internalize. I was starting to become, the Aikido was becoming my second nature, but I felt that I was not getting closer to O Sensei, the founder of Aikido, O Sensei's spiritual legacy.
Yeah.
And nor did I see anybody else expressing it. and that's not a judgment towards any of the Japanese teachers, and all amazing teachers. Some are just more technically driven.
Yeah.
Some are more traditionally driven. It might be the same in karate or in
Yeah.
Gobu.
Yeah.
Some are more tradition driven, to preserve the tradition, and some are more spiritual driven or philosophy driven. So
Yeah, and I think it is common, certainly in my experience across most of the Budo, that in the kind of post-war or post-World War II era,
mhm.
there was a kind of almost detachment in practice in many aspects from the Do element,
Yeah.
with a proportionately much greater focus on technicality, physicality in some cases, and I mean, I've found, I mean, it sounds like you've had a not dissimilar experience, that you have to really go looking to develop that, because one, it's, of course, it's not going to be offered readily from those that are
Right.
able to teach, and I think that's probably a challenge as well, and I guess that's possibly where we'll circle back to. But
Yeah.
I do find that kind of super emphasis on the non-spiritual side of things, for whatever degree of committing to posterity, has definitely caused a shift. And when I look at, so I have this, I don't know whether you know, but I have a very odd and specific period of Budo history that I tend to look at and research, which is the kind of immediately post Meiji era up to
Okay.
the kind of mid to late 60s. And I can really
And
see
why is that your focus of interest?
well, what drew there are lots of experts or self-anointed experts that focus on that kind of pre-Meiji Koryu era, people who are far more knowledgeable and better than I. But I was always driven to try and understand the closest to the source that we could. So with all of the modern Budo that was developing, so obviously Judo with Kano,
right,
in the earlier part, then the evolution of the introduction of karate to mainland Japan with Funakoshi and others, and then of course actually not that long afterwards, and crossing that war era, obviously you do have Sensei coming through at that point. But it always struck me that because I started practicing in the kind of early 90s, that there have been so many generations past, even in that relatively short time, that there was likely to have been either a watering down or a loss or a change in direction or a change in emphasis. So I drew as far as I could to that period, so I could see what people who were the first exporters, if you like, or importers of these Japanese arts to primarily the West were saying. So what was their experience? What did they see? And then obviously comparing it to 2 to 3 to 4 generations of teachers later. So so that's kind of where my emphasis goes. But I absolutely concur that it's very difficult to find, increasingly so I think these days, a teacher who can or will even engage in discussion about what might be beyond.
Yeah, that's, I mean, and that was basically a trend in Japanese culture. The whole society was moving out of that in every aspect, from skiing to whatever, comic books, and everything was moving out of that. So it was natural that it also moved out of it in the Budo fields, in Gendai Budo. The early on Gendai Budo, like with Kano, it was there. It had a foot in each world, like modern and traditional. But then within generation by generation, you could feel that getting watered down, for better and worse. I mean, there were things that were adopted that were probably much better training styles, and there were things that were jettisoned that were a shame to be lost, which is what we're going to talk a little bit about today. But just from an Aikido sense, like Aikido is considered a Gendai Budo, Sensei, even though he was teaching Aikibudo before World War II, and then shortly thereafter World War II, it transferred to Aikido, kind of as Japan moved into this more kind of peace-loving nation that it is today, so to speak. But his dojo, and O-sensei was a traditional man. You never saw him ever. I mean, there's a few pictures of him in pants, before World War II, actually. But you just never,
Yeah.
he dressed in kimono and hakama, and that's how he was. And he lived in a very, after he left Tokyo, he lived in a very, very, very remote countryside of
Yeah.
Iwama in Ibaraki Prefecture. And his dojo was always considered traditional.
Yeah.
Budo, 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 Budo. This is Budo. It's Budo traditional. And now, of course, they did have modern trends there, but it was definitely much more hardcore traditional than Hombu Dojo in Tokyo.
Yeah, well, I think it's famous for having a much I don't know what the delicate way to say it is, but famously Iwama being, I guess, more rigorous in its training approach than
Yeah,
what was emerging in Tokyo at the time. I think that's that kind of
right.
rural gruff,
Farmers,
the nature of the local population
totally.
meant that they were going to be tough and strong, and their occupation or their vocation was going to put them in a position where tough training was probably anything less than
Yeah.
tough training might not be gaining too much favor.
Yeah, and my teacher, Saito, since I don't know how much you know or your listeners will know about him, but he's passed away already for, I guess, 20 years now.
Yeah.
But he was the longest serving otomo, or attendant of Morihei Ueshiba Sensei. And early on, when he got married, he basically, Sensei brought Saito Sensei into his house, and they lived there. And Saito Sensei and his wife took care of Sensei and his wife for, oh my God, I think 27 years he was by his
Yeah.
side. And he was fortunate. I mean, he had a job. He did have a job in the railroad, because it was very post World War II, was just poverty back then. So
Yeah.
he managed to get a job with the railroad. But his job with the railroad, he would work 24 hours on, and I believe he had 48 hours off, and then another 24 hours on. So he had actually, even though he was gone when he was working, he had a lot of time right there with Sensei. And he's the one who got the deepest legacy of Sensei's post World War II teachings. Even though Sensei did spend a week or two, a month in Tokyo, and then he would come back to Iwama, so he was kind of commuting back and forth. He didn't teach weapons. He didn't teach the Bokken and the Jo in Tokyo. He only taught that in Iwama.
Yeah.
And the if you look at the technical tradition that grew from Iwama, it's very different than the modern Aikido that was coming out of Tokyo.
Yeah.
And I'm not, again, this is not like a judgmental comparison. It's just, it's different.
Yeah, I think factually different, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Factually different. Totally. And again, I don't want to get into a lot of, on the downside of that, a lot of people, Iwama, I'm kind of post Iwama. So Iwama's deeply in me, but I'm kind of not in it anymore. I'm kind of, grew beyond it, I guess you could say. But a lot of people that let's say hold true, or they stay loyal to the Iwama line, they'll say that it's they'll go as far as saying that this is the true Aikido, which implies that we're doing, it's kind of like, we're the chosen people, and everybody else is lost. So there's a bit of a shadow to that as well. For Saito Sensei to say that, it was totally fine, because he was right there as Sensei's attendant, and you could look at him, it was true. But there was something unique about Saito Sensei. This is maybe kind of getting a little bit off the topic, but actually it'll come back around to what we were talking about before, is that Saito Sensei, unlike many Japanese teachers, even though he was kind of traditional man, he actually talked. He would tell you how to do things.
Yeah.
And I don't know what it was like in karate and the different arts that you've been studying, but it's quite common in Japan that the teachers just show. And you have to waza no sumo. How's your Japanese?
No, my Japanese is limited to martial Japanese. So
okay, yeah. So waza no sumo means to steal the techniques. You have to watch carefully, and the teacher may say one or two things, but you have to study. And the fact is, the teacher can spoon feed us all day long, but until we've matured internally, what we're getting from the teacher won't really drop in. A beginner, you can tell something to a beginner, and then it doesn't really get it for 20 years or whatever the case may be. So Saito Sensei had an incredible teaching didactic that was very suitable for Westerners, because it was really like step by. He kind of, and he didn't do it out of some type of mental genius. he did it from training for
Yeah.
50 years, that it just became systemized. And he was able to kind of teach systematically that made it easier for people to kind of take on, and really get, like, he could create ability in the student through his teaching methodology.
Yeah, so it's a real departure from that just show, watch, copy.
Exactly right. Exactly. Yeah. And then again, whenever his students would teach, his son is the exception, of course. His son teaches like him, but many of his senior students, when they would be taking the class, they wouldn't dare say anything, because at the same time, you don't want to you don't even try to pretend that you're a teacher for years and years and years and years. There's a whole humility thing.
Yeah.
But we're kind of going around.
We are. So we stopped off there on the way to the fact that I think you'd not quite found everything that you were looking for, or you'd found as much as you could and then went somewhere else.
There you go. So Saito Sensei, he fully took in O Sensei's technical and cultural legacy completely. But he didn't have the spiritual aspect. He wasn't interested in the spiritual aspect, and nobody did in Iwama. Maybe one or two people would claim they did, but anyways, maybe they did. I don't know. I didn't see it. And also I wasn't seeing it around Japan when I was traveling around and going to other dojos. Although I loved everywhere I went and it was beautiful, some more my cup of tea, others less my cup of tea, but still it was just beautiful to be there. I loved it the whole time. And as I was, I realized that I wanted that what I was looking for, I had to kind of go directly, just like I went to Japan to train directly with Aikido at the source. I feel that I had to go train meditation at the source. So I ended up going to Burma, and I guess I won't go too long into the story. But to make a long story short, I ended up going there. Burma, and then later Nepal, the same tradition, Burmese Buddhist meditation school called Mahasi. I ended up going there for 8 years and spending basically every winter for an 8-year period, I would go on meditation retreat, a silent retreat for between 2 to 1 month. 1 year I was there for 10 months, but usually it was around 2 months or 3 months or 4 months that I would be there on retreat, working with teachers in that tradition in meditation. And even though Budo, let's say Aikido and meditation are very different practices, there's something in terms of the internal development, this kind of developmental journey that we go on. You could call it the spiritual warrior's journey. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. And that's when I started to really kind of reflect more and more about not just getting better, faster, and stronger in Aikido, developing technical, but how martial arts, not to mention meditation, of course, but how martial arts help to evolve us as a human being, mature as men or women on the path of practice.
Okay, so does that bring us broadly up to date?
Generally speaking, yes.
But you've I mean, since you've kind of been taking that particular focus to your path forward, I mean, you have traveled and taught extensively with what is quite an unusual focus, isn't it, in terms of being able to try, or at least putting people in a position where they can try to experience that with a more kind of overt discussion and stewardship around it, rather than hoping that if somehow they practice kind of traditional, I'm using kind of air quotes because we're on the screen, but it won't work well for the podcast, but traditional Budo for 4 decades, and suddenly they'll have some kind of spiritual epiphany. I think the reality is that it's being taught or engaging with people who have explored that aspect of a different path is critically different, I think. But you've really kind of focused on that over recent years, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say even I started teaching I actually started teaching Aikido in Japan, but I was just copying my teacher back then. I wouldn't dare do anything that was outside of the tradition. I mean, my teacher made it in no uncertain terms. He said, if you do anything strange, I'm kicking you out of Japan. We were under his eye. We used to say you couldn't fart in Japan without somebody calling up your teacher and telling him what it's like. forgive the metaphor, but that was kind of the truth. So once I left, I actually came into contact with some other teachers, some teachers that were very post-traditional or even non-traditional. A man named Peter Ralston was one of them, and then other spiritual teachers, and they had deeply impacted me. And I started, in some ways, I adopted other methodologies, but I started exploring a lot. And I did realize that my internal search for bringing the martial physical together with the spiritual non-physical, I that was really my whole path has been one way or another, kind of bringing those together.
Yeah.
And I did realize that it wasn't common in martial arts. Not everybody in martial arts, that's not their interest, or maybe they give it lip service, or maybe they have a little bit of interest, but when push comes to shove, it's more about how can we get better, faster, stronger.
Yeah.
And again, that's not a judgment. That's just where people are at, and that's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I was finding that there was a like a subculture of people who did have that interest. And so I started, I did a lot of teaching seminars, like traveling, like you're doing now, traveling seminars. And I would say 1 out of every 7 or 8 seminars I taught was somehow a spiritual martial arts or something like that. It had a lot of meditation, a lot of inquiry, a lot of principles based, and we weren't necessarily focusing on how to get better, faster, stronger in our technique, but how to come into access the deeper principles of the art, access spiritual perspectives, and develop the capacity to, once that access is there, to stabilize an expression of it in the practice. So that's basically what the seminars that I'm giving are like. Then I do that to a certain extent here in my dojo, even though here in my own dojo, we mostly focus on the curriculum, for people to move through the testing curriculum, and occasionally we'll do something. And the reason it's like this is because the fact is most people in martial arts are not interested in that, or they're a little bit interested in that.
Yeah.
And as you know, and this is the last thing I'll say, I'll let you say something. As you know, I mean, just the technical side, oh my God, it could take years to kind of get that under your belt. And then now we got to spend years on spiritual aspects. I mean, it's just a lot to do. And the average man and woman that come to my school, they're lucky to be able to make it a couple of times a week.
Yeah, the reason I was smiling is I've had a not dissimilar experience where actually when I've been teaching at primarily technical seminars, obviously people get to know what your particular focus or interest is. So at least I'd say at least every other seminar that I've attended as a participant or taught at, somebody towards the end, because they've not been comfortable in raising it in a kind of open environment, has sought me out and said, or could engage in some kind of conversation about something which would be deemed to be slightly more esoteric.
And when you say somebody, it's always a minority, though.
Yes, very much so.
Totally. But it's always somebody. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
That's my experience, exact experience.
But that's, I mean, and perhaps that takes us to a kind of long and winding way to what we said we'd probably try and get to, which was the kind of concept of teaching approach or learning approach or route to mastery. Because, as you say, there is this commonality in some aspects, but there's also a huge amount of variability now in terms of what's taught where, and I tend to see some of that being a mirror of this uber push to technical focus. And you and I had kind of exchanged a few comments around Shu Ha Ri before. Is it a good time to kind of get to that, do you think?
Yeah, maybe I'll touch one point before we go into Shu Ha Ri.
Yeah, sure.
Like I have, like here in my dojo, it's pretty more or less homogenous. I have a few black belts that have moved to Tel Aviv and they joined me, so they're kind of doing different style, and that's totally fine. It's we work together pretty well. But technically speaking, since people are going through a curriculum, they're all we have kind of a style here that I've adopted over the years. But when I teach seminars, just to kind of echo what you just said, I came to understand early on, when I first started teaching, like seminars, where the broader public would come, it was mostly, I was fresh out of Iwama, and it was mostly Iwama people. So I could teach what was fresh in me off the mats. But then as my, I guess, reputation grew, other people from other styles would come. And I would realize when I would teach a very specific way of doing things, and they would do those things differently, just because they had a different style, different lineage. It would either they would like and change and do what I did. Maybe they had the maturity just to kind of let go of their stuff and do that. Not everybody has that maturity. Or they didn't get it, or they didn't like it, or it wasn't their cup of tea simply. And there would be an incongruence on the mat. Just energetically, the group would be kind of divided.
Yeah.
And I started realizing, and this is more as my own art moved more towards a principles-based approach, I realized that, for example, take kotegaeshi, the technique kotegaeshi. It's just the name of the technique in Aikido. So I asked people, okay, how many people here are doing Aikido for 5 years? People raise their hand. How many for 10 years? People raise their hand. How many for 20? As you go into upper years, there's fewer and fewer people who put their hands up. I said, okay, how many people have done, so in all those years, how many times have you done kotegaeshi? It's pretty common technique.
Yeah.
So hundreds, thousands, repetitions again and again and again, people have done. Great. How many times have you used kotegaeshi in your daily life? Maybe one person would put their, just rare. Because Aikido people first, they're not really getting it, they're not scrapping it up that much with people. And but just, even if they were, that's just something. And even if you did get attacked, the chance that you're going to get off a clean kotegaeshi is already, that's rare.
Yeah.
So very few people. So then we say, okay, now how about centering? All those years you're practicing, how many times you practice centering, for example? And it's like, oh yeah, it's like 100,000 million times we practice centering. Okay, and then how many times have you used centering in your daily life? Every bloody day people are using centering. So it's like, okay, so this is really the value of the art. We're doing all these amazing techniques, and getting a really fluent technical curriculum, I think, is super important. That's the brush that you're going to paint your art with. It's really important to have that. But so I realized that when I would teach seminars that were more around techniques, it would create division. Naturally, nothing wrong with division, boundaries are good. But when I would teach principles-based seminars, it was always creating cohesion, that the group was really coming together. And that was a really interesting shift for me. And then people that would come to me, they would come to me because of that. Number one, they didn't have to change their style. Two, they didn't feel that there was like this kind of judgment in the room. Oh, my style's like this, your style's like that. I mean, it's natural to have that, but it wasn't there in terms of the context that was being taught. Everybody felt like they were really in, and we were all in this kind of learning process together. And that learning process is not something I had early on. Like, remember I told you before, when I first started teaching in Japan, my teacher told me, and like the first class we had, I was teaching English in a city called Mito. And there was a big university club there that was coming to Iwama once a year. So I knew these young gakusei, and they're fanatical the way they train in Aikido. Not that good in Aikido, but they train like hell. And also there were a bunch of foreigners that were teaching English, that they were teaching English at night, and they couldn't come to Iwama to practice Aikido. So I asked my teacher, Saito Sensei, if I can start an Aikido group. He said, yeah, sure, go ahead. The first day we started teaching, we had something like 30 students. It was just like, boom, it just from day one, it took off. And he asked, hey, how did it go? And I said, pretty good. He said, how many people came? He said, 30. He said, what? And he put his finger right in my face. And he said, you don't screw this up. You teach anything strange and you're out of here. I'm gonna cut you off. So that was it. I just copied him. I would see, and I was translating for him at the time. And I knew his progression. I just knew his whole methodology. So I would see it, then I would go and teach it in Mito, then I'd come back, I see it again that night, and I was translating it.
But meticulous replication as well.
Meticulous reputation, using exactly, not just exactly his technique, but his exact words, how he would teach. And there, the idea of having a principles-based approach wasn't there. Even though I was getting in touch with the principles, it was like, no, this is going to be now. And if people came from a different style, too bad, and then I definitely judge their style or whatever. But that was early on. That's because that's where I was developmentally at that time. And that would be a good place for us to transition to Shu Ha Ri.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think? You want to say something about it first?
Yeah, but I'm just wondering whether, so, I mean, as you will imagine, given the the very conscious use of the word Budo in the name for this podcast, to
Right.
draw a very specifically cultivated and curated audience, I would imagine that most people listening to this will have at least heard of Shu Ha Ri.
Oh, okay, that's good to
Equally,
know,
I would
because
imagine
that's
that
very
very few would
rare.
have would know much beyond the fact that it is a phrase that is often associated with Budo and primarily with Aikido. I think that it's the
Really?
reason I was so
Primarily with
interested.
Aikido.
Yeah,
Huh. Interesting. Okay.
the reason I was so interested when you said we could perhaps have a conversation about it is I've actually seen the 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 concept and in essence the expression slightly hijacked recently in a quite a
Mm,
diluted way.
mm,
And I think it's one of those areas that would really benefit having a kind of meaningful conversation, because people will be interested. I think anything which is which has the method of learning at its center as a topic of interest, I think that's pretty ubiquitous, regardless of the focus that someone has in their practice or their interests. But it's not something that there's almost a rote approach to the rote method of teaching at the moment, because there's been 50 to 60 years of, well, if you're in the UK or in the States, you go to a dojo and they'll have whatever level of competency of teacher or method, and you'll follow that process, and that's the way you learn. And the thinking of, or about the thinking that sits behind that, and how that attaches to the individual, and then how that's drawn through in terms of this notion, which I'm sure we'll come to, that there are transition points in development, but you don't know them until you're in them.
sometimes until
That's a
you
really
after
really
them,
difficult
you know
concept
them
for someone. Yeah.
afterwards. Yeah.
So maybe if you could start with a very I think you'll have
Well, let me
you'll have
just
a captive audience, I think, of real interest, if you want to kind of start from the start.
yeah, if we can circle back just for what you said before, that you've seen well, you didn't say facsimile, but you've seen people using Shu Ha Ri in kind of a rudimentary way or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, can you say more about where? I mean, I'm not to get
I've seen. I mean, I try not to point to specific
sure.
instructors.
But it was in martial arts.
Yeah, in yeah.
Okay.
So I have seen it latched onto in. I've seen a few business gurus that have tried
In
to
business
convert
gurus,
this
right?
into
And
business. Yeah,
yeah,
it's followed the
exactly.
Kaizen type route.
Right.
But this is within martial arts, and
Yeah.
in fact both instances were in karate, and
Yeah.
these were either articles or short soundbite type talking heads things from fairly well-known karateka, not necessarily particularly sort of famous, rather than renowned for skill, let's say.
As scholars or something.
But it really was one of these, we've this is the magic way for you to revolutionize your karate. Learn these 3 paragraphs and go and do it. Go and
Well, there
do
you
Shu
go.
Ha Ri.
Yeah, it's often reduced to 3 paragraphs,
Yeah.
but here's the interesting thing: it's reduced to 3 paragraphs, and people don't really. My experience was there are people who go much deeper, but the average person that knows Shu Ha Ri can't say much about it outside those 3 paragraphs, even though they may have deeper experience. To say that they don't have that experience, but even with those 3 short paragraphs, you can sense the potency of this developmental process. And it's not like it's a lost method, even though it was jettisoned in Gendai Budo, in modern Buddhism, in modern martial arts. That was kind of jettisoned. But it's a term that the average Japanese person has no idea what it means. It's just not common among the Japanese, certainly in modern let's say modern society, and even in tradition. A good friend of mine, Toby Threadgill Sensei. Do you know who Toby Threadgill is?
Yes,
He's
yes.
this. So he's the. Oh, I don't know if he's Soke or whatever. He's the headmaster of a Takamura Ha Shindo Yoshin Ryu, I
Yeah,
believe is his
yeah.
style. His style and his teacher Takamura Sensei. I hope I'm getting the names, my Japanese terms correctly. Anyways, he had a deep understanding of it, and that was part of the transmission. Ellis Amdur, do you know who Ellis is?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I had a really great kind of series of dialogues with Toby and Ellis and a few other teachers called the Shu Ha Ri dialogues. And it was really interesting. It was also eye-opening for me. So there's a few people that, and they're both doing Koryu, the ancient arts, and they both have a pretty good understanding of Shu Ha Ri. But at the same time, very few other people, not that other people don't have it, this methodology. I don't even know if it's right to call it a methodology, but just the tradition it wasn't transmitted through the tradition. Even though people are going through it, there's no question that people are moving through it. There's no guarantee that people are moving through it, but some people do move through it. And in Aikido, I was never taught with Shu Ha Ri. I think the first person I ever read Shu Ha Ri was maybe something from Chiba Sensei. He wrote something that was pretty what do you say? I was going to say impressive, but that's not the word I'm looking for. Pretty intriguing. Deep. Chiba Sensei had deep, the late Chiba Sensei had deep understanding of Budo. And then the second thing I read about it was Takamura Sensei, which was my friend Toby Threadgill's teacher. And he wrote really beautifully about it. And the thing is, when I first heard about, I think I'd also, there's another teacher, I have to give him credit. And his name is The Way of the Stick. He wrote a book. He's a French Swiss man. And I feel horrible that I don't remember
Christian.
He's a Jodo teacher, and he also does calligraphy. And Pascal Krieg, I believe is his name. I could be getting, forgive me, I'm sorry. But he wrote
we can correct the need for apology by adding the acknowledgements in the show notes. So
that's great.
I'm sure for that we'll be forgiven.
Pascal, Blaise, I'm sorry. Anyways, so he wrote this beautiful book called Way of the Stick. It was translated in English, Way of the Stick. It was a Jodo book. And he had this beautiful piece about Shu Ha Ri too. That was the first one that I read, I should say.
Yeah.
And I realized as I was reading it, I said, shit, I'm going through this. I'm working my way through this. I didn't know what Ri is, the most advanced stage. I didn't know what that was at all, though I had my own teachers that were modeling that. But I realized as I read it, it's almost like I live in Israel, so Jerusalem's over there. It's almost like you're halfway to Jerusalem. You find a map, there's a map. It's like, oh, you look at it and you realize, oh no, I was there and I moved to that and now I'm here and that's where it's going. And I started to realize that was going on. And it was so, and I'm a map lover, ever since Lord of the Rings and stuff like that and The Hobbit. Anytime there's a map that I can really somehow internally inhabit the territory, not that the map is the territory, that's always a danger, but I can inhabit that. It just drew me. And that's something that when I heard about Shu Ha Ri, it caught me. And then I've seen my own trajectory go through Shu Ha Ri, my own developmental trajectory. And I actually believe in my case, I'm not saying this is the case for everybody, in my case, having that theoretical understanding of what Shu Ha Ri was or is helped me move through Shu Ha Ri. You can't fake development. You can't wish your way, or you can't have an ego that's going to say, I'm already at this stage of development, because it just doesn't work that way. But if you're authentically going through these stages, you're going through the stages. That's just growth and development. So let's go into what the three stages of Shu Ha Ri are. Shu means to protect and preserve and to copy. It's basically the stage of conformity. So, and again, before I go into, I had a little bit of a debate with Ellis Amdur about this, because Ellis is of the opinion that Shu Ha Ri is only applicable within an Edo period Koryu. A Koryu that comes out of Edo period. It's inside of there. You can't apply it to skiing or basket weaving or professional. So you can't do that. It's only inside the Koryu. Where actually I believe it's a groove in the universe. There's kind of a groove that anybody can go through, that we all go through it. And Toby Threadgill Sensei, he's kind of more on, he also thinks that it's kind of a universal principle.
Yeah.
So
can I just pick one point there, because I mean,
sure.
I of course I've read Ellis's work,
Yeah,
but I don't know.
I love Ellis, by the way.
I don't know the individual. But when he was,
you should get Ellis. Sorry, you should get Ellis on your podcast.
Yeah, no, he's definitely someone who I'd love to engage with. But yeah, when he was kind of hypothesizing about that point around the confinement to Koryu of the Edo period, was that all Koryu, or limited to the martial side? Because obviously there's a sort of link out to Chado or arguably other things where you might see Shu Ha Ri feature. Was it a very specific martial flavor that he was talking about, or was it just the period being the issue?
No, but I think he sees. I mean, I think again, I'm not a Koryu guy, so I could be completely misspeaking here. But I guess Koryu is something that comes from Edo period, was preserved through Meiji and into the modern Gendai Budo. It got to be a little bit marginalized, but there is a Koryu preservation society in Japan.
Yeah.
And I guess that those, like Katori Shinto-ryu is 500 plus years old, and Kashima Shinto-ryu is 600 plus years old, and these are really, really, really old traditional schools. I don't know so much about for the more obscure schools, like Ellis and Toby's traditions are little.
Yeah, so Akari, Ryu, and a few others. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, right. So be that as it may, get Ellis on here. He's and even Toby for that matter. I'm sure they would love to be on your podcast. Anyways, so we got a bit sidetracked.
Yes, we just got to what Shu is.
Yeah. So the reason I got sidetracked, because I believe that this is it's a developmental principle that everybody, when you activate development in the proper way, which I'll speak about in a minute, you go through these stages, whether you realize you're going through them or you're not going through them. So Shu Ha Ri, the first stage, Shu is the conformity stage, Ha is the separation stage, and Ri is the transcendent stage. Shu is a Japanese character that means to protect. Ha is a Japanese character that means to break. And Ri is a Japanese character that means to transcend. You go beyond. And they say that each one of these developmental stage, well, before I say that, the Shu stage it's the conformity stage. So you go into you wax on, wax off.
Yeah.
No more, forgive the metaphor, but or the cliche, but
it resonates with everybody, doesn't it? That's the one phrase which is blind to style, period, era.
Unfortunately, you do what your teacher says. It's like your teacher says, "Job you say is or how far." You just don't question, and you do it, and you do it again, and you do it again, you do it again, and all of the comic book fantasies and Chinese kung fu theater and Japanese old school martial arts movies have that as part of the story. And there's no variations, no applications, no little personal signature, no twist. You do exactly as your teacher shows you to do. And at the beginning, it's pretty ineffective, but that's not the point of it. The point is that your effectiveness what measures the effectiveness is how well or how effective you are at copying the form.
Yeah.
At the beginning. Why? Because at the beginning, we copy a form in order to internalize the principles of that form. But we can do it. We can look at our teacher and say, oh my God, they've got this incredible internal power, or they're so grounded or so centered, or the speed and efficiency with which they're, it's like they're starting after, but they're starting after me, but finishing for me, how did they do that?
Yeah.
You're like, you do something, they're just camped out waiting for you. It's just like, how did they do that? But okay, here's how you do it. You copy the form, and it's slow, and it has a certain amount of effectiveness, but under very narrow parameters.
Yeah.
And they say in the Shu Ha, and it's not just the form, but it's also the dojo etiquette, the whatever cultural implied cultural rules there are in the dojo. That's certainly the hierarchies, the way you put on your gi, the way you sit, the way you bow, how you clean the mats, if you're a beginner, how you listen to the seniors, if you're a senior, how you work with the beginners. There's this whole kind of unspoken rules in the dojo that everybody follows. And in the Shu, and there tends to be also very formal, not always, but pretty formal. That's why we say sensei, and maybe some schools say senpai and others say kohai, and there's dohai, and there's all these things. There's just when it's good, it's good. The good old Japanese cultural traditions. And you copy. You want to become a carbon copy of your teacher, carbon copy of your lineage, and a carbon copy of what the principles are meant to be expressing. However, at this stage, the principles are not quite online yet. It takes time. It takes time for the principles to come online. They say at least like in the Koryu schools, they would say that this is like 5 years of training, and that's probably training every day. Really training every day for 5 years, and you're just copying. Now, at a certain point, what will happen is the forms, as you start to come into contact with the forms, you learn to synchronize the different parts of the body. You learn to synchronize the steps and the movements and the strikes and the counter punch and the turns and the way to the different ways to blend. You learn to synchronize the movements, which eventually will start to integrate. So the synchronization as it starts to internalize, it will kind of hit your center. And at the point that the technical forms start to come from the center, then the process in a way it starts to reverse, because then you start to express the principles outwardly.
Yeah.
Instead of just having an external form. And one of the things I always say about Japan, because when I lived there, I traveled around a fair bit and saw a lot of Koryu schools, and I didn't practice them, but I would go and see demonstrations. And I saw a lot of different Aikido schools as well, and Kyudo and a few other arts. Some of the best Aikido that I ever saw in the world is in Japan. Absolutely, no question about it. Some of the worst Aikido that I ever saw in the world was in Japan. Absolutely, there's no question about it. Yeah. So with the Shu stage, just copying the forms, there is no guarantee that it will internalize. There has to be an intention for that to happen. And ideally, if your teacher is already internalized, you're going to get it through osmosis. You're going to get it just by grabbing them and feeling them and getting hit by them and being thrown by them. You're going to start to get it. And they're probably going to show it to you again and again and again, because that's really the point, not to just have robots, kata robots, but rather people who are really sharp with their kata, but actually they start to internalize. And as that stage matures, as Shu matures, as your conformity stage matures, and you don't ask any questions in that stage, you just say yes sir, yes ma'am, you just do it. Either you do that, or in Japan it's like hi, everything's that. Then the interesting thing is you will automatically naturally move into the Ha stage, which is the application stage. So it's kind of like going to school and learning a formula, mathematical formula. And then you get a job as an engineer and you go to a river or a canyon or something, you have to build a bridge. Great, take that formula, now let's see you build a bridge with it. That's like applying the kata, or applying the theory in this case, to something actually happening. And the second stage is that application stage. So you take the form and say, that's very interesting. Okay, so now let's see you do that. Usually when you're practicing the kata stage, you're working with somebody your own, more or less your own level.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see you work with something more advanced now. Boom, 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 you get all beat up. It's like, oh wow, my katas don't work anymore. Or you work with somebody, you work with 2 attackers, or you work with 3 attackers, or you go outside and work on the beach, or you work in street clothes, or you do a blindfold or whatever. You start applying the katas, and where the kata doesn't work, you can do one of 2 things. You can go back and sharpen up the kata, because that might be the problem, or you can learn how to take that kata and apply it to a new situation.
Yeah. So
And that's
removing
really
the
the learning.
sterility from the environment.
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. And that's the learning edge.
Yeah.
That's the developmental edge. Now, sometimes some people need to go back to basics. Okay, let's go sharpen up your katas. Come on, I'll come help you. And we just go back. But really getting to that leading edge where you take the known and you face the unknown, that's a new learning stage. Now, if you do that with beginners, it's a mess. It's just a mess. The best they're going to do, they might win, but it's going to be with muscle and brute force, and it's so limited. That's why you're always, almost like with beginners, it's almost like a horse where you're trying to pull them back and keep them in, So this second stage of the application stage is absolutely important. And the application stage I'll come back to how I teach it. But in the application stage, again, they say it's about 5 years. But it could, if you're training twice a week, it could be 10 years. Who knows?
Yeah.
But you're just going out there and you're just practice with kids, practice with old people, practice with somebody who's blind, for example, or if you're blind, practice. They're just you want to go into new situations, like you said, remove the sterility or remove the known and start to enter the unknown, and let's see what you got.
Yeah.
And it's good to fall in the face. You want to fall on your face again and again and again and again and again, because that's where we learn. So again, there's a whole nother level of humility that comes in. And at this stage, whereas the ego can kind of hang out in that first stage of the Shu stage, because you're just hiding behind a kata, and you can be very proud and go, maybe you go to, I don't know. Anyway, certainly in modern martial arts, they go to tournaments and they do katas and they get gold medals and trophies.
Oh yeah, kata demonstrations. Yeah.
But there's no pressure tested. I mean, it's pressure to be in a competition. There's no question about that. But it's not really pressure tested. When you enter, maybe let's go practice with somebody from a different martial art, or let's do this, or let's do that. So that all starts. The pressure test actually forces you to change the kata and to something that is actually effective. So what's really working. But the trick is to change the kata without losing the function of the kata, without losing the power that's inherent inside the kata.
Yeah.
Or adapt it. Or adapt it, maybe is a better word.
Yeah, and I tend to find that's one thing that people get quite confused about at that juncture, because it's more than just preserving the essence of the kata, because it is the function. And I've seen a number of instances over the years where complete departure at that point has been dressed up as, oh well, the essence is still there. Yes, you have to go digging quite deeply to find it, but actually what it is a different kata and an emerging different style. And that's, as you say, I suspect that's where a bit of hubris and a bit of ego and a bit of humility cast aside probably becomes a barrier to moving through at that point.
Yeah, and I'm not quite sure if this is exactly what you're talking about, but for example, you could see people, let's say they come from a traditional kata school or a traditional school, doesn't matter the martial art, and then they have a wake up call. They get punched in the nose or something.
Yeah.
Now it's not uncommon for them to start turning around and disrespecting their school. It's bullshit. It didn't work. I did it all these years and Okay.
Yeah.
So they throw it away, and now they stake on this kind of freestyle. Now, again, I don't want to judge, because that might actually be the right thing for that person to do.
Yeah.
But to say that the problem was in the methodology is not necessarily the case. Maybe it's very possible that your school, your teacher didn't have the steps to take you to that next step. It's very possible, or maybe you didn't get that, and then you got the wake up call and you're going to throw it away. That's all fine. But if there's a full maturity in the school that you're with, or your teacher, your tradition, or your lineage,
Yeah.
then there would be like almost like a conveyor belt, a really slow moving conveyor belt that takes years, but the style will move you through these different things. And you want to reach your leading edge where it's almost like a video game.
Yeah.
Level 1, I could shoot and kill all the aliens. I became so good, they don't eat me, they don't touch me. Then I go to level 2 and they're just killing me all the, you need to get to level 2, to the application stage, and get your ass handed to you again and again and again. So you really start to apply. Okay, now I apply. And ideally you would have a lot of seniors that would be there already and say, yeah, welcome to the club, come. And then, and basically work with you in a way that's going to show you, a whole nother level here. And that's the application level. And again, we could go more and more into it, but let's move to the third level, and then we can circle back around to all three. And now the third, again, let's say between 5 and 10 years, when kata becomes internalized at the first stage, the Shu stage, ha automatically begins to appear. And hopefully you'll have a open-minded context that helps you move into that. When ha matures after, let's say, between 5 and 10 years, when ha matures, you automatically start to move into the re stage. And the re stage is where you begin to transcend the forms. And whereas the Shu stage is all about conformity, the re stage is all about free expression. So you've put in your time with applications, applying the art in many, many, many different ways, until that is like deep in you and you've internalized that. And now you can actually move into free expression. And that's the V stage. So in a way, I see this. I mean, your listeners won't see this, but I'll actually share something with them if they want. The Shu stage is like a pyramid.
Yeah.
Bottom of the pyramid is a wide base. So when people enter, there's a lot of room for their idiosyncrasies, and there's a lot of room for their ego, a lot of room for their mistakes, a lot of room for 2 left feet, a lot of room for tight shoulders and all this stuff. Bad posture, a lot of room there. But as you evolve, if the evolution is a line up to the top of the pyramid, the pyramid becomes more and more narrow. So it actually, when you hit the peak of Shu, it's a very narrow gate.
Yeah.
That there's no room for ego to get through there. There's no room for your idiosyncrasies to go. You really want to conform. And then as you move through that, as you move through the top of the pyramid, the further development is the pyramid becomes inverted. So again, it's a very narrow, it's like more like a V.
Yeah.
It's a narrow gate at the bottom, but as you evolve, there's just more and more space. So, a mark of a really beautiful, let's say, but somebody who has some level of mastery, is that they just got so much space and freedom.
Yeah.
They're not, you can I'm thinking of the old Pink Panther movies, where Kato would Inspector Clouseau. Of course, he was a bit of a fool, but basically anybody could attack you anytime, and you're just kind of always there. There's just a freedom.
Yeah.
You don't need special conditions. They don't have to attack you like this for it to work. It's just the art has become so internalized that now it's just naturally expressing out of you.
Yeah.
And that would be the D stage. And again, there's a developmental aspect of that. That's another 5 to 10 years of practicing that until you've basically transcended it all. And yeah, that's Shu Ha Ri. Now, I do know of although I don't know him personally, I know of an American Aikido teacher named William Gleason Sensei, and he's an old timer. He's been around for a long time, teaching for many, many years. He says that in a person's Budo lifetime, they need to go through Shu Ha Ri 3 times.
Okay.
So there's like cycles. Even beyond that, there's more cycles. There's more cycles. It's like deeper grooves. You're just digging deeper grooves and deeper grooves. And I'm not at his age, and I'm certainly not at his years in the martial arts. But there's something, when I heard that, something about that, it's like, you know what? That actually, I can
That resonates. Yeah.
That resonates totally.
Yeah.
So, okay. So maybe if you want to say something about it, because I can also tell you how I work with these three stages. But
no, but I mean, I've kind of let you roll, because I think that was a brilliant summary to get people who perhaps aren't au fait with it a bit more a greater degree of understanding. But as you say, it's a very odd thing, isn't it? Because we're describing a concept and we're describing a developmental path, but it is also an experiential one. And it's, I kind of said earlier on, it's one of those things that if you're aware of, because I try not to refer to Shu Ha Ri as a framework, because actually a framework suggests that you can just do it. It's a model, and right, I'm going to do some Shu this week and some Ha next week, and I'll be at Ri by the time we get to February. Obviously, that I think it just probably oversimplifies it, but
I agree.
It's this I guess ability to understand it at least at a base level of the concept, then as you say, helps you at least place where you are, and then hopefully makes the route through to whatever the next staging post is a bit easier to accommodate and see. I think one of the questions I was going to try and pick your brains on, I'm conscious of time as well, so we try and keep these to an hour-ish, but I suspect we might be coming back to
ain't gonna happen unless you want to do part two.
well, one of the things that I really wrestle with, as I think anyone that's listened to any of these podcasts before will know, is this kind of emerging dichotomy of I don't see, I'm not a campaigner for the arts to change or to modernize in their construct or their context. But I think what we do see at a rate which seems to be accelerating is societal and generational changing kind of around the arts. So we now have at least 2 generations of very high expectation of entitlement and instancy of delivery and very quick gratification, which of course is the antithesis of something like Shu Ha Ri. And is that something we should be trying to bridge? Is it something that we have to just accept excludes an increasing number of people who might be otherwise drawn to Budo? Is there I hypothesize about this frequently, and I know there's a broad range of views as well, so I was quite keen to get your thinking on that.
Well, I mean, so again, I think Shu Ha Ri is a methodology or a framework, whatever we want to call it, that comes out of classical Budo. But I also personally, I think it's a universal principle. Doesn't matter if you're a butcher or a baker or a candlestick maker. If your nose is to the grindstone and you're really there perfecting your craft in those cases, you'll come out of it. It's a path of mastery, Shu Ha Ri. It's a process of mastery. Anybody who you look at them and you say, oh my God, they're a master. It could be a bowler. I don't care, bowling. You look at them a master, I would say that they've probably been through Shu Ha, that they've been through that. If you're not through that, you can master Shu, you can master the Shu level, and you can master the Ha level. You can't master the Ha level unless you've mastered the Shu level. So there is a hierarchy there. But really going through it all, you come out of it. Again, this is a bit of a gross generalization, but you come out of it with a level of mastery. Now, take somebody who, because I have a couple of businesses, I have to do a little bit of marketing for my businesses. So I know how marketing and social media and stuff go. I'm not on TikTok, but I know TikTok's kind of the latest trend, and it probably reflects instant gratification. It's reducing our attention span to, what is it, 4 seconds or something? I don't know,
something like that.
It's something ridiculous. So it's that let's say the especially with social media and devices these days, and algorithms and marketing, we are certainly, our kids are encouraged to have a short attention span. And that's superficial. That's always going to keep us at a superficial level. So that's a problem. As a parent, as much as I do, know that. However, I think somebody could become a master at TikTok if that's what they wanted. Again, I'm not doing TikTok, so I don't know. But I think if somebody went into TikTok and they built their channel and they did all their things and they knew TikTok and they knew how that certain culture and algorithms worked, they could, if they spent 5, 6, 7, 10 years doing that, they would also maybe go through this process of Shu Ha Ri.
Yeah.
So anything can be done superficially up to a certain point.
Yeah.
But if we take something and we want to go deeper, if we see it as a path of mastery, a developmental path, there has to be a little bit of leaning into it with total focus, total sincerity, and hopefully some good morality, that we're actually doing it for not to just make ourselves better, but to make the world better, and serve other people. That's in the end of the day, that's what the Budo path is. Although, anybody can become Darth Vader in Budo, or on TikTok for that matter. The ego can take it over and just get that power and use it for personal reasons.
Yeah.
So,
well, I mean, I tend to, I don't know whether you disagree, but I tend to feel that there is almost an implicit moral virtue in Shu Ha Ri. I mean, yes, as you say, you always get the.
Well, see, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
I mean, yes, I get you. You can have your your emerging supervillain who may evolve in or develop in the same way, but with a kind of layer of acute malevolence. But I don't see that very often, and I do think that when you talk about this narrow gateway, I think one of the inbuilt barriers to passage there is that there has to be at some level a parallel of moral virtue or values to drive that through.
I'm 100%
almost like a self-filter, I think.
I completely agree, and that's what the Koryu do. All the Koryus had a moral code.
Yeah,
it might have been a moral code just for their clan, and we can chop off the heads of the other people, doesn't matter. But we take care of our people. I mean, that was back in the day, right? But there is a moral code, hopefully. But even like in Aikido, Sensei's teacher, he was an incredible. Sakaku Takeda was one of the most fearsome martial artists of his day, but he was a horrible human being. I mean, the Daito Ryu guys might not like to hear that, but historically speaking, he would kill dogs and people and whatever. He seemed to be, maybe that's just the Aikido story. So again, forgive any Daito Ryu people out there. Forgive me if I dissed your lineage, but see, and this is for me, it's a bit of an open question, because I believe that Shu Ha Ri, you need to have that moral code. It's inherent in it, but I also think that somebody can come out of it, and the ego is just a funny thing, that it can appropriate power for itself. In fact, that's just what it does, and it can be misused. So, and Toby and I spoke about this, Ellis and I spoke about this. The tendency is to become a better person. Anybody who moves through these stages, especially if you have a very wholesome lineage that you're following.
Yeah.
But there's no real guarantee. There's no real guarantee. But I would say that if you're a jerk at the Shu stage and you authentically move through Ha and into Ri, that the jerkiness will be much, much less, if not completely gone.
Yeah.
But and here's the other side. When there's not a Shu Ha Ri, like in a lot of the Gendai Budos, it's very easy to be forgive my language, to be an asshole as a beginner, and to be an asshole as a black belt.
Yeah.
And not only that, and you're going to create a whole dojo with students that become assholes. That's easy to happen. There's something off on that, and that's what's beautiful about the traditions, because the traditions did kind of polish the stones, so to speak.
Yeah.
But there is no guarantee. There's always a bad apple that can come out of there.
Yeah, but I think as you say, I think there is a degree of self or collective filtering, actually, that means that hopefully those rougher stones going through the sieve are increasingly fewer, because it's hard. I think the thing which we almost talk about as, again, implied for obvious reason, especially when you're talking about really substantial commitments, not just of time, but of effort and sacrifices that you have to make to move through at any rate. You've got to be consistent and committed and dedicated and open and all the things that we've talked about. But that in itself, unless you've got an incredibly determined malevolent, then that the effort of or associated with any kind of meaningful step beyond just superficiality at entry does tend to be a filter, and we see plenty of people who come in, don't like it, doesn't happen quickly enough, and actually that bridge of
which is the developmental moment, by the way.
Yes,
people come in and it's just, there's something about them that's like, great, you're right on. Thank you for you came to the right place. Now you can leave if you want, but it's important. Actually, you don't have to say this, but they're leaving at a developmental moment.
Yeah.
If it's not their cup of tea, okay, it's not your cup of tea, that's fine. But when somebody feels internally challenged because they're on a path of practice.
Yeah.
In fact, if they're on a path of practice, we're going to reach our limitations sooner or later, usually sooner. If we're not reaching, if we're just being comfortable on the path of practice, it's not an authentic path. It's not a higher path. It's not a developmental path, certainly in terms of human development.
Yeah.
So that has to be, that's baked in to the path.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And actually, that's probably a decent time to start to pull this to a close, because I could talk about this with you for way beyond the time that we would hold anyone's attention on their daily commute or whatever they're doing when they pick up this podcast. But in the event, as I'm sure many will, that they wanted to learn a bit more, go a bit deeper with you, I know you've got some materials and some resources as well. Where should they look to hear more from you on this particular and obviously linked topics?
Well, I mean, the best is my website. So it's theintegraldojo.com, theintegraldojo, one word, .com. It's a blog, and I have tons and tons of content there about meditation and or Budo and or Aikido. Also on Facebook under Miles Kessler. Also, the Integral Dojo is a Facebook page.
Yeah.
And on Instagram, you can find me at Miles Kessler. Now, something that your listeners might be interested in is I have a 5-page PDF on Shu Ha Ri, and it's basically 5 charts. It's a reference guide in 5 different graphic charts, showing first just basically what Shu Ha Ri is, then how this inverted triangle, the triangle and the inverted triangle. So this kind of the developmental pathway of Shu Ha Ri. Also how I teach Shu Ha Ri in my methodology. So basically, for me, Shodan is, generally speaking, it's when people complete Shu stage.
Yeah.
And the Nidan is, generally speaking, when they kind of go through more or less, maybe it's not right to say complete, but more or less go through the Ha stage. And up to Sandan is where they start to kind of open up to the Ri stage. And in those developmental methods, I have Kihon Waza and Kironagata Waza. So Kihon Waza is basic techniques, flowing techniques, techniques and movements.
Yeah.
All of that stuff is the Shu stage. Then I teach Henka Waza, which is variations, the technical variations, and Oyo Waza, which is the technical applications. I teach those bodies of Aikido, those bodies in the curriculum. I teach those at the Ha stage. And in the Ri stage, I shouldn't say I teach, because I teach all these at different stages, but you need to master Shu, and you need to master basic techniques and flowing techniques in the Shu stage. You need to master applications and, variations and applications at the Ha stage, and you need to master counter techniques, Kaishi Waza, and Jiu Waza, free expression at the Ri stage.
Yeah.
So that's how there's a hierarchy in technical. And what makes those different bodies, from basics to flowing to variations to applications to counters to free expression, what makes those a hierarchy is that each time you move to another body of knowledge, it has more complexity. It demands more complexity. So more complexity means you got to spend a few years getting in there and practicing it.
Yeah.
So it's actually developmental ladder. Anyways, that's very clearly laid out in the reference guide. So there's a 5-page reference guide.
And how would people get hold of that?
So I have a website. So I will maybe we'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah.
So they have
if I link to all of your platforms, and specifically the method for going to get that particular PDF, so people can look at
It's
exploring
called the
this.
Shu Ha Ri reference guide.
Perfect.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Well, that's been absolutely brilliant. I've really enjoyed that. It's
yeah, Craig.
fantastic
I
subject
feel like
to
we could share for hours.